Pebble Island, 14th of May 1982. Late autumn in the South Atlantic. The wind across the airstrip is constant and cold. The kind of cold that settles into clothing and equipment and doesn't leave until morning. The island sits in near total darkness. 40 square miles of exposed moorland north of West Falkland, a place most people in Britain had never heard of and couldn't find on a map. 7 families lived here in a sheep farming settlement built around the logic of isolation. 25,000 sheep, a handful of houses, and a grass landing strip used occasionally by supply flights. The Argentine Air Force had arrived in late April and turned that strip into a forward operating base they designated Aeródromo Auxiliar Calderón, which they called Isla Borbón. Parked on that strip were 11 aircraft. They weren't in the air. They weren't armed for a mission. They were sitting on the ground in the dark, attendended by a garrison of roughly 150 Argentine personnel, who believed the nearest serious British military threat was still aboard ships well to the east. 6 of those aircraft were FMA IA 58 Pucaras, twin-turboprop ground attack planes, built in Argentina and designed precisely for the terrain and conditions of the South Atlantic. They could operate from the rough grass strip that jet aircraft couldn't use. They flew low enough and slow enough to kill helicopters, strafe troops on open ground, and reach landing craft in shallow water. Argentina's Grupo de Ataque had deployed them here from their peacetime base at Reconquista in northern Argentina. 4 Argentine Naval Aviation T-34C Turbo Mentors and 1 Argentine Coast Guard short Skyvan completed the inventory. 6 weeks after Argentine forces seized the Falkland Islands on April 2, 1982, the British task force was fighting its way south toward an amphibious landing. Those aircraft threatened everything that landing would require. The SAS was going to remove them before they flew a single sortie. 45 men from D Squadron, 22 SAS, would make the crossing by helicopter from HMS Hermes and cover 3.7 miles of boggy moorland in darkness to reach the airstrip. They would carry explosive charges, mortar bombs, rocket launchers, and M16 rifles. A County-class destroyer would stand offshore in the dark, its 4.5-inch guns ready to fire. The operation had a hard extraction deadline tied to the safety of Hermes herself. Every minute of darkness was planned. Nothing was improvised. From insert to extraction, the entire raid would last 5 hours. 11 aircraft would be destroyed. The Pebble Island garrison would never threaten a British soldier or ship during the landings 6 days later. A small raid, precisely executed, with a shadow that stretched well beyond its 30 minutes of active destruction. To understand why those 11 aircraft mattered enough to send D Squadron 3.7 miles into the South Atlantic dark, you need the arithmetic of the task force's vulnerability. Britain had dispatched its largest naval force since the Second World War. Carriers, destroyers, frigates, amphibious ships, supply vessels, across nearly 8,000 miles of ocean to conduct an opposed amphibious landing against a garrison of over 13,000 Argentine troops. The task force was built around HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, 2 carriers operating fewer than 30 Sea Harriers and RAF Harriers between them. Those aircraft were the only fixed-wing air cover the fleet had. Britain's nearest land airbase was Ascension Island, 3,500 miles away, making RAF Phantom participation entirely impossible. The task force had to do this alone, with what it had brought. Argentina, by contrast, had its main striking power: A4B and A4C Skyhawks, IAI daggers, Mirage 3EAs, and Super Étendards, carrying French-built AM-39 Exocet missiles, based along its eastern coast at Trelew, Comodoro Rivadavia, San Julián, Santa Cruz, Rio Gallegos, and Rio Grande. That string of bases extended almost 600 miles, giving Argentine aircraft multiple approach vectors toward the British position. The 800 to 1,000-mile round trip to the Falklands pushed Argentine jets to the absolute edge of their fuel limits and made operations deeply reliant on just 2 tanker aircraft. But it also meant Argentina could absorb losses at a rate that would cripple the British carrier group. Argentina's numerical superiority in fixed-wing combat aircraft was approximately 6-1. The carrier group was the operational centre of gravity, and everyone knew it. Destroy the carriers, and the campaign collapsed. Damage them seriously enough, and the landings became impossible. Admiral Sandy Woodward understood this better than anyone, and kept Hermes and Invincible well east of the islands for precisely that reason. As far from the threat as possible, while still projecting air power over the contested territory. On May 4, 1982, an Argentine Navy Super Étendard of the 2nd Naval Fighter/Attack Squadron, refueling from a KC-130 tanker before dropping to wavetop altitude, launched an AM-39 Exocet at HMS Sheffield. The crew had not been called to action stations. A visual sighting from the bridge was the only warning. The missile struck amidships and detonated inside the hull. 20 sailors died. Sheffield burned for days and sank under tow on May 10th. The first Royal Navy warship lost to enemy action since 1945. The Exocet threat, which planners had long acknowledged as theoretical, had become violently concrete. Then, on May 12th, a 1,000-pound bomb struck HMS Glasgow during a Skyhawk attack, passed through the engine room slightly above the waterline, and came out the other side without exploding. Glasgow's fuel tanks ruptured. Her propulsion system was heavily damaged. She limped north toward Ascension and played no further part in the war. 2 of Britain's 3 Type 42 destroyers sent with the original task force were already out of the fight, and the San Carlos landings hadn't happened yet. These events, Sheffield and Glasgow, had both occurred before the Pebble Island raid was executed. Every British commander understood the arithmetic. Argentine air power could remove ships from the campaign faster than the task force could absorb the losses. There was no fleet in reserve. What was there was what there was. The threat from mainland-based fast jets was real and demonstrated. But there was a second, different threat, suited to a different target set. One that operated not from the mainland, but from the islands themselves, and not against ships, but against the most vulnerable phase of the entire operation, the moment British troops left the ships and went ashore. The Falkland Islands had Argentine aircraft at forward positions, but Stanley's airstrip couldn't be extended sufficiently for high-performance jets. Argentine engineers had failed to solve that problem before the war started, and it was a critical failure. Fast jets needed a certain runway length and surface quality that the islands couldn't provide. Pebble Island's grass strip was never intended for Skyhawks. It was intended for the Pukara. The FMA IA 58 Pukara was a twin-turboprop counterinsurgency aircraft developed and manufactured in Argentina. It flew at around 500 kilometers per hour, too slow for air combat against a Harrier, but perfectly matched for low-altitude ground attack. It carried two 20mm Hispano 804 cannons, four 7.62mm FN machine guns, and provision for bombs, rockets, and napalm. Its designed role was anti-guerrilla warfare, finding and destroying light infantry, vehicles, and helicopters operating in open, difficult terrain. The Falklands landscape, boggy moorland, no tree cover, constant wind, was exactly the environment the Pukara was designed to dominate. What the Pukara couldn't do was engage fast jets in air-to-air combat or conduct effective anti-ship strikes. Its radar and weapons matched ground targets and slow-moving aircraft. What it could do, very effectively, was exactly what the British were about to need their helicopters and landing craft and open-ground infantry for. At San Carlos Water, where the amphibious landing was planned for 21st May, British troops would be ferrying ashore in landing craft, setting up Rapier air defence systems in the open before they could be dug in, moving supplies across exposed beaches, flying constant helicopter runs between ships and the growing beachhead. All of that was Pukara country. The goose green Pucaras, the ones that survived a Sea Harrier cluster bomb attack on May 1st that had already destroyed 3 aircraft there, would go on to demonstrate the threat directly. On 28th May, during the Battle of Goose Green, 2 Pucaras from that base found a Royal Marines scout helicopter during a casualty evacuation mission, locked on and shot it down. The aircraft was ferrying a wounded soldier. That engagement happened from Goose Green, not Pebble Island, because by 28th May, the Pebble Island Pucaras no longer existed. That result had been engineered 11 days earlier by 45 men and a destroyer.
Pebble Island measures 4 miles at its widest point and covers roughly 40 square miles in total.
Standing on it in May 1982, you would have felt the terrain as much as seen it. The ground underfoot was saturated bogland, the kind of surface that swallows a boot and holds it, that makes every step a calculation, that adds exhaustion to a march the way a heavy pack does, but less predictably. There was no cover. The Falklands generally have no tree cover to speak of, but Pebble Island had even less than the larger islands. Nothing between the wind and your face except more wind. The westerlies came in off the South Atlantic with full fetch, nothing to slow them for hundreds of miles, and in May they carried rain and cold that worked into every gap between clothing and skin. The Argentine garrison had arrived in this environment and built a forward operating base in it. Approximately 150 personnel, Air Force ground crew, naval aviation technicians and security forces had set up around the airstrip and the small settlement where the island's farming families lived. The strip itself was waterlogged by May's rainfall, restricting operations, but the aircraft were serviceable. The garrison had not invested heavily in perimeter security. Argentine patrolling was poor and sentry positioning inadequate. These weren't combat-hardened troops dug into prepared defensive positions. They were technical and support personnel, managing a forward base that was supposed to be too remote and difficult to reach for a British direct action raid. That assessment was about to be proven wrong. The intelligence that made the raid possible came from the ground, not from signals intercepts or aerial reconnaissance. Around 10th May, boat troop from D Squadron, 22 SAS, inserted onto Pebble Island by Klepper collapsible canoes, the waterborne infiltration technique that gives the troop its specialist designation. Boat troop had been fresh from South Georgia, retaken on April 25th, when they were tasked with this reconnaissance. These were men trained in covert maritime insertion in the worst conditions a maritime environment could produce, and the South Atlantic in May was testing that training continuously. The patrol found something that changed the entire plan. The headwinds between HMS Hermes and Pebble Island were significantly stronger than predicted. In practical terms, this meant helicopter transit time to the island would be longer, eating into the window available on target. The original planning had assumed 90 minutes for the assault on the airstrip. The Reconquista's wind data compressed that to 30.
30 minutes to destroy 11 aircraft, reach an ammunition store and fuel depot, and withdraw to the extraction point before HMS Hermes had to move. Everything that was secondary to destroying the aircraft had to become genuinely secondary. The planning emphasis shifted accordingly. Aircraft first. Everything else only if time permitted. What the patrol confirmed, beyond the wind data, was the intelligence the raid needed. 11 aircraft were counted and identified by type. The airstrip layout was mapped. Argentine garrison positions were located. The sentry pattern was observed and found wanting. Poor patrolling. Inadequate coverage of the approaches from Phillips Cove. The ground between the landing point and the airstrip was assessed. A member of boat troop who had walked this exact ground during the reconnaissance would later navigate the assault force to the target in darkness. Back aboard HMS Hermes, Major Cedric Delves, commanding D Squadron, briefed his men on what the recce had found and what the 30-minute window required of them. The force organization followed from the objective. Mountain Troop was assigned the aircraft, the primary task, the only task that counted. The remaining personnel would secure the approaches to the airstrip and form an operational reserve in case the garrison produced a serious, coordinated response. Attached to the SAS force were personnel from 148 Make Tila Commando Forward Observation Battery, artillery spotters from 29 Commando Regiment Royal Artillery. Their job was to direct the naval gunfire from HMS Glamorgan with the precision the plan required. The attached 148 Battery Forward Observation Officer would coordinate that fire in real time. HMS Glamorgan herself, a County-class destroyer armed with twin Mark VI 4.5-inch guns, would operate with HMS Broadsword as air defence escort. Broadsword Seawolf missiles gave the pair mutual protection against Argentine air attack while they manoeuvred into range of Pebble Island. Coming that close to the coast was a calculated risk for the Royal Navy. Exposure to Argentine aircraft was real. And it was a risk Hermes was also accepting by reducing the distance the Sea Kings had to fly. One constraint governed everything. HMS Hermes had to withdraw before daylight. First light would expose her to Argentine air attack. The extraction deadline was approximately 7:30. Every element of the raid, the helicopter transit, the 3.7-mile march to the airstrip, 30 minutes on target, withdrawal to Phillips Cove, helicopter recovery, had to fit inside that window. The planners built no slack into it. There was none to build in. 2 Westland Sea King HC-4 helicopters of 846 Naval Air Squadron lifted from HMS Hermes's deck and flew west toward Pebble Island in darkness, carrying 45 men of D Squadron. The flight crossed open water in South Atlantic conditions, cold, windy, turbulent, with the pilots navigating by instruments and the men aboard managing their equipment and their focus. There was no margin in this flight for mechanical problems, navigational errors, or weather that went beyond prediction.
At 23:45 on the 14th of May 1982, the helicopters touched down at Phillips Cove on the northern shore. The men dismounted into the dark and the cold of a May night in the Falklands. The wind was moving. The ground underfoot was boggy and uneven. Each man was carrying at minimum 2 81mm mortar bombs, in addition to his personal equipment, weapons and demolition kit. The force collectively had offloaded over 100 L-16 81mm mortar rounds from the aircraft, along with explosive charges, 66mm LAW light anti-armor rockets, M16 rifles, some fitted with M203 40mm grenade launchers, and general-purpose machine guns. The specific demolition kit was thermite grenades, wrapped in PE4 plastic explosive, set with 4-second fuses. The march from Phillips Cove to the airstrip covered 3.7 miles of Falklands moorland in darkness. No lights, no noise discipline failures permissible. The navigation was conducted by a boat troop member who had crossed this exact ground during the reconnaissance, the same man who had paddled a klepper canoe to the island days earlier, moved overland, counted aircraft, mapped sentry positions, and returned. He was now leading 45 men back to the same destination. In darkness, over saturated ground, carrying heavy loads against a hard deadline. The Argentine sentry positions were as the reconnaissance had found them, poorly placed, inadequately covering the approaches from Phillips Cove. The raiding party moved through without contact. They reached the airstrip perimeter and could now see, in whatever minimal ambient light existed, the shapes of Argentine aircraft parked on the grass strip. 11 of them. 6 Pucaras, 4 Mentors, 1 Skyvan. Mountain Troop moved toward the aircraft. The protection force established positions securing the approaches. The mortar team set up. HMS Glamorgan, offshore in the dark, waited for the signal. The 148 Battery Forward Observation Officer called for fire. Glamorgan's first shells landed on the western edge of the runway. Diversion fire, designed to pull Argentine attention toward the perimeter and create the confusion inside which Mountain Troop would work. The sound of 4.5-inch naval gunfire at close range isn't subtle. Each round leaving Glamorgan's twin guns crossed the short distance of dark water and arrived on the grass airstrip as a concussive event, the kind that makes personnel in the open dive for cover and personnel in buildings press against walls and wonder what is happening. What was happening was Mountain Troop moving aircraft to aircraft. For 5 aircraft, the method was internal placement. A man approached the aircraft, broke the cockpit glass with whatever tool was appropriate, the sound of breaking perspex absorbed into the larger noise of Glamorgan's bombardment, and inserted a thermite grenade wrapped in PE4 with a 4-second fuse into the cockpit. 4 seconds is enough time to move clear of an aircraft, not much more. The man cleared. The charge detonated. Thermite, burning at approximately 2,500 degrees Celsius, doesn't produce an explosion in the conventional sense. It produces a white-hot incendiary reaction that melts through metal, that can't be extinguished with water, that destroys whatever it contacts and the materials around it. Combined with the PE4 explosive rupturing the airframe outward, the result was an aircraft that burned from the inside out and was structurally destroyed within seconds. 1 aircraft. Move to the next. Break the glass. Insert the charge. Clear. Detonate. Move. The decision to place each charge in an identical location on each aircraft, in the cockpit of each type, was deliberate and coldly calculated. Charges placed consistently meant that even if Argentine personnel reached the aircraft quickly after the raiders left, They couldn't rebuild one aircraft from the salvageable components of another. The damage was methodically identical. No spares, no cannibalization. All 11 aircraft permanently out of the Argentine order of battle. For the remaining aircraft that couldn't be accessed for internal placement, mountain troops switched to external weapons. Small arms fire from M16s and M203 40mm grenade launchers walked rounds into airframes. LAW rockets, 66mm shoulder-launched anti-armor weapons, were fired into aircraft bodies and engines. Mortar rounds from the team's 81mm tubes came in on targets as required. Some aircraft had their undercarriages shot away beneath them, the landing gear collapsing under impacts and leaving the fuselage on the ground. Others burned. The T-34 Mentors and the Skyvan, lighter and less robust than the Pucaras, required less to disable permanently. Once all 11 aircraft were destroyed or burning, the covering fire from the 148 battery observer shifted Glamorgan's guns. The ammunition dump was next. Then the fuel store. The secondary explosions from the ammunition dump, Argentine ordnance, ammunition for the aircraft's weapons, stored aviation munitions, added another layer of noise and light to an airstrip that was now fully illuminated by fire. The watchtower came down under naval gunfire. The fuel depot burned. The Argentine garrison had remained in shelters during the bombardment. This is recorded in Argentine accounts, and it isn't a criticism. Glamorgan's 4.5-inch shells were arriving at an unpredictable rate on positions where remaining in the open meant exposure to lethal shell fragments. When the garrison emerged from shelter and began to engage, the raiding party had already finished its work and was regrouping for withdrawal. The incoming Argentine fire was inaccurate. Small arms and machine gun rounds went past without finding targets. The return fire from the SAS wasn't inaccurate. M203 grenade launchers and small arms fire suppressed the counterattack quickly. One British soldier was hit, shrapnel from charges the Argentines had planted under the airstrip's surface to deny it to the British, triggered by the garrison in the belief that the operation was a full-scale assault to seize the base, rather than a raid to destroy its aircraft. A second man was also reported as likely injured in the extraction, though accounts vary on the exact cause and precise number. No British soldiers were killed. The party regrouped. The man who had navigated the approach now navigated the withdrawal. 3.7 miles back across the bogland to Phillips Cove, now carrying a wounded soldier against a ticking clock. The Sea Kings were there, the men loaded aboard, before daylight, before Hermes became visible to Argentine air patrols. The helicopters were back over open water. Total time on the island, 5 hours. Time spent actively destroying aircraft, approximately 30 minutes. Mark Splash Aston, one of the participants who later spoke publicly about the raid through the Falklands War Mapping Project, described Operation Prelim with characteristic economy. The force went in, did the job, and came back. 11 aircraft, no fatal British casualties. The mission the recce had confirmed was executable had been executed. At San Carlos Water on 21st of May 1982, 6 days after the Pebble Island raid, British amphibious forces came ashore. What followed was one of the most intense sustained air attacks on a naval force since the Second World War. The Argentine response came overwhelmingly from mainland-based fast jets. Of 4 Skyhawks from the Argentine Air Force and Navy, IAI Daggers, Mirage 3s, and a Macchi M B339. HMS Ardent was struck by multiple bombs and sunk.
HMS Antelope was damaged and later sank when a bomb exploded during disposal attempts. HMS Brilliant, HMS Broadsword and HMS Antrim all took hits. HMS Antrim absorbed 2 unexploded bombs in her engine room. 17 Argentine aircraft were destroyed during the battle. The attacks continued for days. British sailors and airmen paid for the San Carlos beachhead in blood and aluminium and burning fuel. Not one aircraft from Pebble Island participated in any of it. The distinction matters because it defines precisely what the raid did and didn't accomplish. The fast jet threat to British ships at San Carlos was never the Pucaras' mission. Exocets and 1,000-pound iron bombs from Skyhawks were the weapons that sank frigates. The Pucaras at Pebble Island were never going to threaten HMS Ardent in the way that Argentine naval aviation threatened her. But the troops coming ashore in landing craft, the Sea King and Wessex helicopters shuttling ammunition from ships anchored in San Carlos water, the Rapier missile teams setting up in exposed ground before they could establish any kind of defensive arc, the logistics chain being built on beaches under open sky. That was precisely what the Pukara was built to kill. A Naval War College analysis of the raid assessed that it had a significant impact on the Argentine commander's ability to prevent the establishment of a British beachhead, and credited the Pebble Island direct action operation with helping to open that beachhead for a successful landing. A Marine Corps University study was similarly direct. The Pebble Island airfield was targeted and neutralised by British Special Forces specifically to relieve the aerial threat to the upcoming amphibious assault at San Carlos. The British identified the aircraft as a specific threat to the landing and removed them before they could be used. The goose green Pucaras, the ones that survived the 1st of May Sea Harrier attack and were never raided, confirm what the Pebble Island aircraft might have done given the opportunity. On 28th May, 2 goose green Pucaras found and shot down the scout helicopter on its casualty evacuation mission. One Pukara was shot down by 2 para ground fire during the same engagement. Another was destroyed by a Stinger surface-to-air missile fired by the SAS on 21st May, the same day as the San Carlos landings, which indicates how actively Goose Green's surviving aircraft were operating. These aircraft flew when they had targets. They found targets. They killed. The Pebble Island aircraft found nothing. In the period when the San Carlos beachhead was most vulnerable, when British troops were still transferring from ship to shore, when the Rapier systems weren't yet operational, when the logistics chain was exposed and disorganized and improvising, the Pebble Island Pucaras were ash on a waterlogged grass strip. The Argentines had partially repaired the runway within 8 days of the raid, but no aircraft returned to operate from it before the Argentine surrender on June 14th. 6 of Argentina's approximately 24 island-based Pucaras destroyed in 30 minutes, roughly 1/4 of the entire Falklands Pukara deployment. Roughly 1/10 of Argentina's total Pukara fleet of approximately 60 aircraft. 4 T-34 Mentors eliminated. 1 Skyvan gone. The ammunition store destroyed. The fuel depot destroyed. The radar station confirmed and put out of action. The Argentine force on Pebble Island played no role in opposing the San Carlos landings. That sentence is the operational measure of what those 30 minutes achieved. The raid is dated to 1982. The doctrine behind it's older by 40 years. David Stirling founded L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade, in Egypt in July 1941. He was a captain at the time, a commando officer who had served with lay force and who had been developing, largely in his own head, an idea for a new kind of unit doing a new kind of work. His proposal went to General Claude Auchinleck with the argument that conventional large-scale commando raids were expensive in men and equipment, poorly targeted and tactically predictable. What Stirling wanted instead was small teams, 5 men, no more, penetrating enemy rear areas without the logistical tail that conventional forces required. His target was enemy airfields. Stirling's reasoning was straightforward. An aircraft on the ground is defenceless.
An aircraft in the air requires a trained fighter pilot, ground control, fuel, maintenance, weather cooperation, and an aircraft that hasn't already been shot at to defeat. Destroying aircraft in the air required all of those things from the British side as well. Destroying aircraft on the ground required a small team, the right demolition charge, and enough surprise to reach the airstrip perimeter. In terms of resources expended versus aircraft destroyed, there was no comparison. Stirling's aim was to penetrate unguarded and exposed airfields and place bombs on the aircraft, to prove that 50 aircraft on a single airfield could be destroyed by a handful of men working in darkness. The weapon that made this viable was developed by Lieutenant Jock Lewis, the SAS co-founder, whom Stirling later called the brains behind the regiment. Lewis had a specific problem. Existing demolition charges were either too heavy to carry in sufficient quantities across the distances the desert raids required, or insufficiently reliable against aircraft. He needed something small enough for a man to carry several of, reliable enough to destroy an aircraft with a single placement, and incendiary enough to prevent recovery of the airframe. He solved the problem by combining thermite, an incendiary compound that burns at temperatures hot enough to melt aircraft-grade aluminium, with an explosive material. The Lewis bomb, as it was named, used the explosive to rupture the structure and scatter the thermite into the fuel systems, while the thermite itself burned with a heat that no amount of fire suppression could extinguish. 1 man, 1 charge, 1 aircraft destroyed. The first successful SAS airfield raid came in December 1941 at Tamet Airfield in Libya, led by Captain Paddy Mayne, while Stirling simultaneously attacked another target. Mayne's team placed charges methodically across the parked aircraft, blew the bomb dump and withdrew. 14 aircraft destroyed, 10 damaged. The concept had been tested, and it had worked. From that point, the SAS began raiding airfields across the North African theatre with a consistency and effectiveness that alarmed the Axis command. By July 1942, the raids have become tactically sophisticated. On the night of July 12th, the SAS hit Fouka Main Airfield in Egypt and destroyed 22 aircraft. 2 weeks later came what is still considered the most audacious single airfield attack in SAS history. On the night of 26th to 27th July 1942, Stirling led 18 armed jeeps, each carrying 4 Vickers K machine guns loaded with tracer ammunition, across the Egyptian desert to Sidi Hanish Airfield, a complex 235 miles west of Cairo. The raiders drove in column formation across the desert, without headlights, navigating by compass in moonlight. As they approached the runway, the airfield's lights came on. A Luftwaffe bomber was coming in to land. Stirling fired a green flare and ordered the jeeps forward in V formation, directly onto the runway. What followed lasted approximately 15 minutes. 18 jeeps driving through the parked Luftwaffe aircraft, Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, Ju-52 transport aircraft, Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, firing continuously with their Vickers guns, tracer rounds igniting aviation fuel and ammunition. German troops responded with machine guns and anti-aircraft weapons. One jeep was destroyed, one SAS soldier killed. In return, 37 German aircraft were destroyed or damaged. Paddy Mayne placed a bomb by hand in the engine of a parked bomber before withdrawing. The raiders escaped into the desert before daylight.
Across its North African operations, the SAS destroyed more than 300 Axis aircraft. Mayne's personal tally of destroyed enemy aircraft exceeded the score of any Royal Air Force fighter ace of the war. The SAS didn't achieve this by building a bigger air force. It achieved it by putting small teams on airstrips in darkness with demolition charges. This isn't mere historical texture. Mackay and Cooksey's detailed account of the Pebble Island raid states explicitly that Operation Prelim was the first purely SAS airfield attack since late 1944, and possibly the largest assault mounted by the regiment since the Jebel Akhdar operation in Oman in 1956. The description across multiple accounts that the raid echoed back to some of the unit's first missions during the North African campaign isn't the editorial flourish of writers looking for a narrative hook. It's the accurate description of what the SAS was designed to do and was still doing 4 decades after Stirling drew up his original proposal. Consider the technical continuity. Jock Lewis's bomb combined thermite with an explosive compound. At Pebble Island, Mountain Troop used thermite grenades wrapped in PE4 plastic explosive with 4-second fuses. The specific materials had changed across 40 years of explosives engineering. The functional principle, incendiary compound plus explosive, placed inside an aircraft's cockpit or engine, was identical. The decision-making behind the demolition methodology at Pebble Island wasn't reinvented in 1982. It was inherited. The more important continuity was doctrinal. The SAS didn't raid Pebble Island because commanders sat around HMS Hermes reading regimental histories and deciding to honour tradition. They raided Pebble Island because a small team with demolition charges and naval fire support was the correct instrument for a specific, solvable problem. Aircraft on a grass strip that jet aircraft couldn't reach. A garrison that couldn't be bypassed diplomatically. A threat to an amphibious landing that couldn't be deferred until after the event. The factors pointed to a ground assault, with the mission weighted entirely toward destroying the aircraft. That is exactly the type of problem the SAS was built for in 1941, and it remained the type of problem the SAS solved most efficiently in 1982. What the Pebble Island raid demonstrates about special operations isn't that small teams can occasionally punch above their weight with sufficient bravery. It's more specific and more useful than that. It demonstrates that special operations produce their most disproportionate results when the target is identified precisely enough that a small action removes a defined capability entirely, before that capability can be used. Stirling understood this in the desert. The British Task Force planning staff understood it in 1982. The 30 aircraft per month that the North African raids were destroying couldn't fight. The 11 aircraft destroyed at Pebble Island in one night couldn't fly at San Carlos. Honesty requires acknowledging what the raid didn't accomplish and what it couldn't have. The Argentine garrison at Pebble Island was approximately 150 personnel. The 45-man British force was outnumbered roughly 3-1 on the island. The raid worked not because the British outfought a superior force in a sustained engagement. They didn't attempt one. They reached the aircraft before the garrison understood what was happening. executed a demolition sequence against 11 aircraft in roughly 30 minutes, and left before a serious coordinated response could develop. The Argentine accounts indicate that personnel remained sheltering during Glamorgan's naval bombardment. By the time they emerged and engaged, the demolition was complete. The success depended on the recce being accurate, the intelligence being acted on quickly, and the plan being tight enough that nothing could slip outside the 30-minute window. Remove any one of those elements and the outcome changes. The broader Argentine air threat wasn't eliminated by destroying Pebble Island's aircraft. Mainland-based Skyhawks and Super Étendards continued to fly throughout the campaign. Goose Green Pucaras continued operating until their aircraft were destroyed individually or their airstrip at Goose Green was overrun. The broader air war over San Carlos was brutal and costly for the British. Ships were hit on May 21st and for days afterward. HMS Coventry was sunk on May 25th. The Atlantic Conveyor, a merchant vessel pressed into service carrying helicopters and supplies, was struck by 2 Exocets and sank on May 25th, taking with it Chinook helicopters the land campaign badly needed. What can be said with precision is what the claim ledger supports with high confidence. The Pebble Island aircraft were removed and therefore couldn't threaten the San Carlos landing. The specific threat they represented, low-altitude attack against slow-moving targets in the San Carlos approach during the most vulnerable phase of the landing, went unexecuted. Whether removing 6 Pucaras and 4 Mentors altered the broader outcome of the campaign is a larger question with a less certain answer. What can be said is that those aircraft weren't there when they would have mattered most. 6 days before the most dangerous moment of the entire campaign, the British eliminated one entire layer of the threat to it. The landing at San Carlos was still dangerous. It was less dangerous than it would have been. The Pebble Island raid isn't the SAS operation most people remember from 1982. That distinction belongs to the disasters and near disasters, the aborted Operation Mikado against mainland Argentine Super Étendard bases, cancelled before it was mounted, and the various operations that generated controversy or casualties. Clean operations leave fewer dramatic survivors to write memoirs. Pebble Island worked efficiently, and efficiency is harder to dramatize than catastrophe. What it left instead was a result. 11 aircraft destroyed, an airstrip neutralized, a garrison left to dig defensive trenches around burned-out airframes. The archaeological evidence of those trenches was still present and documented when survey teams mapped the site in 2024. A carrier brought dangerously close to the Falklands coast, held there long enough to put the raiders ashore and recover them, then withdrawn before first light. 40 years after David Stirling walked his proposal into Auchinleck's headquarters in Cairo, D Squadron Mountain Troop was placing thermite grenades wrapped in PE4 into Argentine aircraft cockpits on a South Atlantic grass strip, using the same functional principle Jock Lewis had engineered for desert sand. The distance from the Libyan desert to the Falkland Islands is considerable. The tactical logic is continuous. Captain John Hamilton, one of the officers involved in the demolition operations at Pebble Island, was killed later in the campaign during a separate naval gunfire spotting mission on West Falkland, a loss the regiment still marks. The raid he helped execute outlasted him in consequence. The aircraft he helped destroy stayed destroyed, and the Pebble Island Pucaras never flew a combat sortie. The SAS didn't need to control the skies over Pebble Island. It needed to deny them.
A handful of men moving through darkness and South Atlantic weather changed the next day's air threat before the next day began. The aircraft never got their chance to matter. In a war where ships could be lost in minutes to a single missile strike, where Argentine pilots took half-second targeting decisions at wave-top height, where the margin between recoverable and catastrophic was constantly thin, that wasn't a small result. Finding the right target and hitting it before it can be used is the most efficient form of warfare a small force can execute. Not winning an air battle. Making sure the air battle never happens. Special operations produce their most decisive results when the target is chosen precisely enough that a small action removes a threat entirely, before the threat has a chance to become a problem that requires a much larger response.
On the night of the 14th of May 1982, on a cold grass strip in the South Atlantic, that principle was demonstrated with thermite, PE4, and 30 minutes of darkness. Subscribe for more stories like this.